It's my favourite time of the day. Yep, the GBNews pub is open, and that's terrific. And for the first time on Talking Pints, I will not be having a pint of beer. This is not because I've signed the pledge or anything like that. It's because our guest has impeccable taste, and he wanted to drink English sparkling wine. And given that I come from the county of Kent, which is producing magnificent sparkling wines, as good as, or if not even better than champagne, I've decided that given his magnificent choice, I'm going to join him tonight with an English sparkling wine. Trevor Kavanagh, welcome to Talking Pints.
Cheers, Nigel.
Well chosen, you.
British bubbly at its best.
Just terrific. Let's start with today. Lots of things about you. You've had a very long career in journalism, but let's start with today. I have been banging on, as it were, about the Channel migrant crisis. I started off in March 2020. I felt that government weakness, they may as well put a sign on the White Cliffs of Dover saying, all welcome. I've been predicting all the way through that the numbers would rise and rise and rise, and 1,185 last Thursday. My guess is tomorrow will be huge, again, given the sea conditions. And I was, last week on the show, twice, I actually, in front of the camera, held up the daily newspapers, talked about the other broadcasters, and said, nobody is talking about this. Despite the fact there was 500 came one day, nothing in the newspapers. 695 came the next day, almost nothing in the newspapers. You today have written a very, very strong piece about this, because you feel, as I do, that actually Boris is in trouble on this, isn't he?
I think he's in increasing trouble. He's been in trouble because of sleaze, obviously, over the last week or so. But I think that will pass. I think that other events will overtake it, and one of the events that I predicted will overtake it is immigration. And it's been simmering away in the background for as long as you and I have been covering or acting in politics. And it has been noticed, by the way, that you've been leading this campaign.
Well,
so your enormous credit.
Because it matters to people.
Of course it does. It's the biggest single thing, I think. Once you strip away people's day-to-day worries about cost of living, the possibility of being stabbed in the street or their kids getting involved in drugs or something, the thing that worries them most of all, and has done for the last 20 years, has been uncontrolled mass immigration. And we don't know exactly how many illegal immigrants have entered this country in the last 20 years, but Migration Watch won't put a figure on it even, but their private view is that it's probably around 4 million, either legal or illegal. But we certainly think that at least 1 million, probably much more than 1 million, have come in illegally. And I think that's intolerable by any standards of fairness, even on the basis of legal immigration. People who are queuing in orderly fashion in other countries to come here by going through all the hoops and hurdles of immigration.
And spending money in doing it.
And spending money. Yep. And, I mean, there's an awful lot of headaches involved in getting into this country legally. It's absolutely painless coming in illegally.
Yeah, no, it really is. No, I think Boris is in very big trouble on this. And you're right, sleaze comes and goes, and it doesn't help. But I think he's in very, very big trouble on this. But why, Trevor? You've been involved in current affairs and politics and media much longer than me. Why is there this reluctance to cover the subject? Why does it have to reach a real boiling point before anybody even wants to talk about it?
And even now, Nigel, I don't think people really want to talk about it. Not in politics, not in the frontline politics. The public, yes. But you know as well as anybody what it's like when the moment you start mentioning immigration, you are immediately branded a racist or a fascist. And that has been the plight that both of us have had to suffer since Tony Blair took the decision in early 2000s to open the door to all of the accession states. But at the same time, we were opening the door to all sorts of other refugees. And I said to him once, have you noticed that the face of Britain is changing? And he looked at me as if I just crawled out from under a rock. And after the conversation, one of his SPADs said to a colleague of mine, he's a fascist, isn't he? And that is how they shut the debate down.
That's right. That's right. Racist, extremist, all the rest of it. Yeah, they're still very, very reluctant to cover it. Now, before we get on to your long, fascinating journalistic career and the big, big characters that you've worked with, well, the biggest in the business, just share with the audience what made you become a £10 pom and head off to Australia.
Well, I suppose I'm an immigrant, or an immigrant.
Well, you were an early Brexiteer. You Brexited Britain, didn't you?
Well, I was an export reject because I came back. Well, I mean, the great thing about the £10 POM era, I went out when I was 22, and for £10 you were on the other side of the world, and I thought, well, I've got to stay for at least 2 years to qualify. And from there, I can travel back if I want to via any part of the world. I can come back through Asia or through America. As it turned out, I stayed for the next 4 years, got married and came home after that. I mean, Australia was the most fantastic experience for me in the 1960s and 70s when all sorts of doors were open to an ordinary journalist, whereas you'd have Buggins turn in this country, to some extent, less in journalism than in other careers. But in Australia, everybody I came across in their 30s was the heads of sort of the whole Pacific Basin or something for whatever they did. People were rising up to become editors or deputy editors or specialists because there were vacancies and there were opportunities.
And Britain was a bit stuffy by comparison.
Britain was very stuffy back then. I mean, things have changed a lot, and you can make rapid progress these days. But the great thing about Australia was it was a real, genuine egalitarian society where if you did the job properly, you got promotion. And they threw me into the sort of deep end as a political editor in Canberra of the paper I was on, which is now the now defunct Sydney Daily Mirror. And it was just 6 months before Gough Whitlam was sacked. Yeah. Huge, immense stories. I mean, you couldn't...
Because this was where the Queen, of course, got involved, didn't
The Governor-General sacked him,
Interesting, interesting. But you came back, and it was with an Australian, of course.
Yes.
That you have made a very big name in journalism. You've probably been the most influential journalist in the last 40 years because you became political editor of The Sun in '83. You were there through some very dramatic moments, the Thatcher years, the battle with the miners' unions and Scargill, ERM, which we'll come back to in a moment, Major, and of course, in a way, you were partly responsible for Kinnock not winning that election, weren't you?
Oh, I wouldn't possibly. I mean,
well, the Sun newspaper. The Sun newspaper was, and
well, the Sun is the thing. I mean, the Sun has been one of the most potent forces in British politics and in British society, in a way that is almost impossible to imagine happening as it did in the 1960s and 70s and then through the 80s.
Because there was no internet.
No internet. Everyone turned to the Sun as the breaker of big stories. We were the first to break the stories. And other newspapers used to. And I remember the editor of the Times, Peter Stoddart, paying us the ultimate tribute and picking up the latest splash, Sun splash as it came off the presses, and they're sitting there having their evening conference and saying, if that's in the Sun under that byline, we can just lift it. I mean, that was amazing. This is a super soaraway Sun you were talking about.
It was, I mean, politically very, very powerful. We had Kelvin MacKenzie on a few weeks ago.
Yeah.
You know, a highly controversial character, but clearly very, very good as an editor.
Yeah.
What about Rupert? I mean, how close to Rupert Murdoch have you been over the years?
Well, by the very nature of things, you don't do politics for his favourite newspaper without him wanting to talk to you now and again.
And he, of course, a newspaper man at heart.
He's a Sun man at heart.
Yeah.
Not just a newspaper man. I think the Sun is his baby. I think that even today, he is more interested in the Sun as a newspaper than possibly any other part of his business. Obviously, there are things like Fox TV and so on,
which is enormous.
Very important.
Yeah.
But the thing that he loves, the first love of his life, was the Sun 45 years ago, or whenever it was. And it's been, after all, it was the font of his fortune. It was the fortune that it made allowed him to build Sky and then go to America and build his American business over there. It all came from the Sun.
Yeah. No, I mean, his career's astonishing in terms of what he's achieved and I mean, the influence that he's had. Kelvin, working with Kelvin, come on, be honest, what was that like?
It was a combination of terrifying and exhilarating and also very temporary. Because my wife and I used to make plans for what we would do in 3 months' time when I got the sack. Which I did once. I got the sack, as everyone got the sack.
What did you do to get the sack?
Nothing.
Because he sat in that chair a couple of months ago, and I said to him, in a sort of slightly accusorial tone, I said, Kelvin, you were a tyrant when you were on the Sun, and I wonder what his reaction. He said, yes, I was, and I loved it.
I said that to him, and he took it as a compliment.
Yeah.
And I said, no, I won't say the word I actually used, because but he knows very well that he was a very tough boss who often went over the top in more ways than one. But at the same time, there's a sort of unerring way of getting the readers on side and building upon everything that went before. And we very nearly got to the point of the 5 million a day circulation under his editorship.
Which today seems almost beyond comprehension.
It certainly does, doesn't it?
When you talked about Australia and that sort of meritocratic society where people could climb the ladder very quickly regardless of age or class or all of those things, in a sense, was that what attracted you to Mrs. Thatcher?
Well, in a sense it was, because I watched a Labour government fall apart because of typical Labour Party policies on spending and borrowing and the way the economy crumbled. I came back to Britain in 1978 during the winter of discontent, just as it was beginning.
Yeah.
I mean, in those days, people don't remember and probably cannot imagine what it was like to find themselves. And in those days, they had proper winters. They had a foot of snow that you had to trudge through.
Well, this is before global warming, is it?
Oh, Lord, yeah. Before the new ice age. So you really did have to battle to get on a bus because it was overcrowded, because there's only one bus going. There's a strike in every direction, the post office workers and so on. And then Thatcher came in, and you had to... The machine that she brought in, some of the cabinet ministers she had, were really first-rate. They were tough. They'd worked out their policies before winning the election, and they put them into effect. Nigel Lawson, I think, although he came a cropper in the end, was a brilliant chancellor or treasury man at the beginning. Geoffrey Howe, to his credit, was an enormous success dealing with inflation and tax reform.
Painful medicine, there wasn't.
Painful medicine, yes. I mean, inflation shot up to, what was it, 26%?
27%, I think it was, yeah.
26.5%, I think. Anyway, whatever it was, I can remember going into supermarkets and the shop assistants would be running around with a little sticker tape, putting new prices on over the top of 3 or 4 other new prices as the prices rose day by day. I mean, that was terrifying. And, you know, mortgages just went through the roof. You couldn't get a mortgage. In fact, when we first arrived back in England, I would beat a path around the banks and building societies, and they'd say, no, come back next year.
You can't believe it. And no, I mean, listen, it was very tough medicine. She was very unpopular in some quarters, but the economic policies did work. And I was part of that as well. I was a member of the Conservative Party, and I believed in it. I thought it had to be done. But you mentioned the fact that you came back to a Labour government that was high spend, high tax, and I put it to you, we have a Conservative government that is high spend, high tax, state control at every level. This is not a Conservative party, is it?
Well, I think that an awful lot of the present cabinet would echo those views, and in private they do. I mean, they literally hold their hands up and talk about the money that's being hurled at the NHS and at COVID, and also the taxes, the national insurance contributions going up. Everything's going to go up next year in a way that we cannot imagine, because we haven't been through it for the last 20 or 40 years.
It's really 40 years, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
Inflation is now... I know that the Treasury, the Chancellor, is very worried about inflation. I know that the banks are very worried. The Bank of England itself is not actually doing its duty either on this. And once inflation gets out of control, it's very difficult, as we know, to get it back into control. I think it's going to go way beyond the 6% they're talking about. I think it's going to be 8, 9, maybe even double figures.
I do. Inflation is a disease of money caused by government, is what Enoch Powell told me 30 years ago. And, I think all the evidence is he's right. Is Boris going to survive? On the face of it, big majority, I mean, it should be easy.
10 days ago, I would have said yes. I'd have said that he was comfortably ahead in the polls. He hadn't been behind in the polls. He had delivered Brexit. He had got the vaccination programme going. And I would have thought he was unassailable, at least by the Labour Party, as it was then. It was only 10 days ago. Yeah. And I think that he blew all that in one...
A long time.
It is. 10 days is... So I think he blew all of that in one stupid move.
Yeah.
And I don't know what on earth possessed him, but it was his move.
Because if Patterson had taken his medicine, he'd have been back in the Commons before Christmas. It would have been just yet another MP being
We wouldn't have noticed.
Knuckles. And lots of Tories, the posh Tories, sitting on 20,000 majorities with their big second incomes, could have carried on having their second incomes, which now look threatened. And the 2019 intake, who were very different people, more Thatcherite, really, former coal miners and aspirational people without the same very posh backgrounds. They're now worried that sleaze could make them lose their seats. He seems to have really upset both sides of the parliamentary party.
He has, and a new development has taken place in the divisions in the... It's not just Remainers versus Brexiteers now. It is those red wall seat Tory MPs versus the old guard. Who,
the Toffs versus the Oiks.
The Toffs, yes, or the Spartans, as they call them.
I like the Oiks because, to me, the Oiks are the eukification of the Conservative Party, and in a way they are.
Well, they're your boys, really.
Yeah, absolutely.
Girls.
Yeah, absolutely. Brexit, Trevor, you were always very, very strongly Eurosceptic. And I just want to finish on this point. I don't think the public really understand what an important role Rupert Murdoch played, and you played, back in 1997, without which I believe we would have joined the euro, which would have been economically catastrophic and would have made Brexit very, very much harder to achieve. Just explain what happened with, I mean, you know, your newspaper had fallen out of love with John Major, and I get all the reasons why. Blair was off to the races. Just explain, just tell us, for historical record, what happened with Blair, the euro, the referendum pledge.
Well, it's very simple. He would have gone for the single currency without a referendum, and he was very powerful at that particular point. At that point, he'd been victorious in Iraq, and he could easily have carried that without anyone against it at all. Even Gordon Brown couldn't have stood in his way if he decided. And as I understand it, he was told by Rupert that were he to go down that route without a referendum, then we would have to campaign against it. And at that point, as you say, the Sun was a potent force.
And you'd hurt the Labour Party in the previous election. Yes,
and I think that gave Blair pause for thought. And he promised a referendum, and from then on, the referendum was inevitable. And it, thanks to you, actually took place.
Well, and finally, Trevor, what's the high point of it all been?
Just doing the job, frankly. I mean, I'm absolutely stunned that it's now been 40-odd years since I started working for The Sun and for Rupert Murdoch, and I've had the most exhilarating career you could possibly have, even possibly more exhilarating than yours.
Well, you see, someone like Trevor Kavanagh, he's an old journo, he's an old hack, he's never going to retire. He still writes a column in The Sun every Monday, and it's the first thing I turn to every Monday. That was Trevor Kavanagh, who joined me on Talking Pints.
Welcome to the GB News YouTube channel. You can watch us live 24 hours a day, catch up on your favourite shows, and join in the conversation in the comments below.
Don't forget to subscribe and you'll never miss any of our exclusive content.